Many of the 1 to 3 diamond cards in Pocket have reused art from past generations of play. In this video, we will cover the 8 card arts that were first released in 2008 during the 4th generation, and discuss how the Pokemon were designed then, as well as how different they are now. We will also talk about how it would look if some of them had their old effects in Pocket, and speculate on the impacts to the game. We have been unable to find any competitive deck lists for the examined Pokemon in their debut generation, as many of them were just pack filler at the time. However, that doesn't mean there wasn't anything interesting to discover. Please let us know down in the comments if there's anything we missed and if you think Pocket should bring over some of these effects into the game. Also, as a note before we hop into these 8 cards, we'll be covering the Stormfront set in a different video, so expect those 6 cards later. Pop Series 6, or Pokemon Organized Play Series 6, was the name given to a set of promotional cards released between September 2007 and March 2008. With 17 cards in total, this was the first promotional set to contain cards from the Diamond and Pearl era of play, and many of these cards, with the exception of Pikachu and Gible, were reprints from either Diamond and Pearl or Mysterious Treasures. The only card so far from this small promotional set is Kagemaru Himono's Buneary appearing in Shine and Revelry. This Buneary was a direct reprint of Ken Sugimori's Buneary in Diamond and Pearl. In its debut of Diamond and Pearl, and reprint in Pop Series 6, Buneary was an extremely forgettable card. It had the low HP of 50 and only 2 attacks, Splash for 10 damage at the cost of 1 energy, and Jump Kick for 10 plus 10 to a benched Pokemon for 2. While this is certainly not revolutionary, it develops a theme that is continued in its evolution. Lopunny in Diamond and Pearl also has 2 attacks, Healing Wish, which has you flip a coin until you get tails, and heals one of your Pokemon for the number of heads, and then it has Flop, dealing 30 plus 20 damage to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. This is a bit more interesting in that if you're lucky, Lopunny can fully heal any Pokemon for 1 energy. Flop is an okay attack, just with a steep cost for effectively a total of 50 damage, though the benefit of bench sniping cannot be understated. Overall, Lopunny, and Buneary by extension, are interesting tech cards, albeit too weak in the fast-paced metagame of Diamond and Pearl. In Pocket, Buneary is a simple, low-cost, nimble attacker with 50 HP, and 1 attack dealing 20 for 1 energy, which is maintained in its evolution to Lopunny, where it doubles its HP value and gains 10 damage on its attack. However, this is an extremely weak stat line, and Lopunny and Buneary remain as pack filler as you're looking for Giratina EX. Both of these take inspiration from their Diamond and Pearl counterparts, insofar as the low cost attacks and immediate value generated. However, like many of the cards in Pocket, these Pokemon are much simpler versions of their older selves. Overall, there could have been a niche for the Buneary line if it maintained the Healing Wish attack, maybe as an ability specifically because it's coin flip based, and Lopunny being a colorless Pokemon makes it much more flexible, and will give at least reason to be considered beyond just yet another low-cost, low-damage attacker. Great Encounters was the 4th main set in the Diamond and Pearl era, released on February 13th, 2008. It notably contained legendary level X Pokemon such as Cresselia level X, Darkrai level X, Dialga level X, and Palkia level X. Floatzel from the Shining Revelry set is the only Pokemon that has been carried over so far into Pocket from Great Encounters. Illustrated by Koki Sato, in its debut, Floatzel has 80 HP and 2 attacks, Agility dealing 20 damage and potentially blocking all effects of attacks done to Floatzel for 1 turn, for the cost of 2 energy, and then Aqua Jet dealing 60 and 10 to a bench Pokemon for 3. This provides a solid damage curve coming off its pre-evolution of Weasel, where Weasel can hit for no energy or 2 energy, allowing for the Pokemon line to keep up with other Stage 1 and some Stage 2 Pokemon. In fact, over the course of 3 turns, Floatzel can deal a total of 90 damage to the opposing Pokemon, which is enough to knock out a good deal of the comparable Stage 1 roster at the time. Unfortunately, that is the cap for Floatzel, and is susceptible to higher damage counterattacks if it misses on agility. Overall, there was definitely some potential, but it went unrealized in the face of a meta centralized around Gallade and Gardevoir. In Pocket, Floatzel realistically lacks any potential. While there are similarities between its Water Arrow attack dealing 30 damage to a bench Pokemon for 1 energy, it really isn't enough for Floatzel to see use within the Water type. The most comparable card to what Floatzel is trying to do is Sneaky Lee from Genetic Apex, which is a powerful bench sniper. However, 2 things make Hitmonlee far and away better. First, it's a basic Pokemon, so you don't need to waste a turn evolving, as the early turns are the most important for bench sniping. And second, it fits in fighting toolbox decks, which appreciate low investment single price Pokemon. Water just doesn't have an aggro deck to fit Floatzel in, and it is a stage 1 Pokemon, so you lose 50% of your consistency compared to running something like Hitmonlee. Overall, Floatzel would have been much better if it retained the actual damage it dealt to the active Pokemon in Great Encounters, since then it would serve as a Palkia EX Light that can hit the bench for Cyrus plays, while applying pressure to the active. That said, I'm not sure it would see play, as there's simply just much better things you can be doing in water decks. Majestic Dawn was the 5th set in the Diamond and Pearl era, released on May 21st, 2008. This set continued to focus heavily on Generation 4 Pokemon, with Pokemon Level X being new evolutions of old Pokemon, such as Glaceon Level X, Leafeon Level X, and Porygon Z Level X. Pocket has transferred 4 Pokemon from this set to the game. Illustrated by Koki Sato, Leafeon from Space-Time Smackdown is the first Pokemon from Majestic Dawn we will cover in this video. In its debut generation, Leafeon, along with its Gen 4 counterpart Glaceon, were rare holo cards, which is usually a designation held for rare and desirable cards. While it is currently a relatively expensive card to pick up with a price tag north of $40, it unfortunately was unable to break into the meta. This Leafeon possessed 2 attacks. The first, for 1 grass energy, was Bind Down, dealing 30 damage and trapping the target for 1 turn. The second was Leaf Guard for 2 more colorless energy and dealing 60 damage with the added benefit of reducing damage to Leafeon by 20 the following turn. On its own, these seem a bit underwhelming for the meta at the time. However, it is clear that this Leafeon is just a stepping stone into the more powerful Leafeon Level X from the same set. Leafeon Level X has self-built ramp that works from the bench as well as the active slot, and its only additional attack, Verdant Dance, deals more damage based on the energy attached to all of the Pokemon. Theoretically, you could just use the rare Holo Leafeon to stall into Leafeon Level X, and then close out the game from there. It's not particularly good, but it is better than the Leafeon we see in Pocket. In Pocket, Leafeon was released as part of the Space-Time Smackdown set focused on Generation 4 cards. Leafeon was a fairly simple card with 1 attack, Leafy Cyclone, dealing 90 damage for 2 energy, which was quite high at the time. However, there was one drawback in that the next turn, Leafeon can't attack. We have seen this drawback see some success with other cards such as Buzzwole EX from Extra Dimensional Crisis, but the problem for Leafeon was during this set, 90 damage wasn't enough on its own to clear the premier stall card, Druddigon, which had 100 HP. It just missed out on this crucial breakpoint, and was overshadowed by cards like Magnezone as a high damage attacker. It would also be outclassed by its EX counterpart in the very next set, cementing its place as an entirely forgettable 3-diamond card. That said, if original Leafeon had been brought over 1-to-1, it may have seen marginally more play, with the utility of Bind Down locking in opposing lead Pokemon, and only allowing switches upon KOs. However, I do not believe it would have had much staying power based on how the meta has advanced. The next card to look at from Majestic Dawn is Kagemaru Himono's Lickitung from Genetic Apex. In its debut generation, it didn't see much competitive play, but it had a niche as a solid opener reminiscent of Kangaskhan from base set nearly a decade prior. For 1 energy, it draws a card from the deck. It also has a second attack that, for half the cost of Comet Punch, has half the potential damage, and is still coin-based. However, unlike how Kangaskhan was quite prevalent early on in the TCG, decks have moved way beyond needing to draw 1 card off an attack, and thus Lickitung saw little to no play. In Pocket, this card has the rare attack of flipping coins and dealing damage based on the number of heads. While this can theoretically deal infinite damage if you're lucky, it can also just as easily deal 0, so an extremely risky card. This is iterated on in its evolution from Space-Time Smackdown, Licky EX, with its Licking Fury attack for 4 energy. It deals a flat 100 plus 40 damage for each heads you flip with no limit. However, the high cost and potential seriously low roll made both of these cards unviable in the meta, even though there were some ramp builds that attempted to play them. That said, had the original Lickitung been ported over in Genetic Apex, I believe it would have been meta relevant. A big colorless basic with 2 attacks for low cost, 1 drawing cards and the other dealing up to 40 damage, would be quite viable, perhaps competing for deck space with Genetic Apex Kangaskhan. Nowadays, I don't believe it would see any play, but back in the beginning of the game, it may have been a contender. The third card to look at from Majestic Dawn is Kagemaru Himono's Vaporeon, also from Genetic Apex. Vaporeon's template was very similar to the previously discussed Leafeon, as well as the other evolutions released in this set, including Jolteon and Glaceon, as they all had 2 attacks, one for 1 energy dealing 30 with an effect, and the other for 3 for 60 damage with an effect. In the case of Vaporeon, its first attack, Cleanse Away, acted a little like Irida, or like Wigglytuff, in that it healed all of the bench Pokemon for 20 damage. The second attack flipped coins until you got tails, and removed an energy from the target for each heads. These effects are more beneficial than Leafeon's, but yet it still didn't see any play in its debut generation. In Pocket, Vaporeon actually maintained a lot of its original templating, just with the simplified flair of Pocket's card design. It kept a 3 energy attack dealing 60 with an effect, and this time it self-healed for 30. However, the 1 energy attack for 30 is now gone. This card is still much worse than its Majestic Dawn counterpart, and it was immediately outclassed by another copy of itself in the Mythical Island set. However, had the original Vaporeon been released, it could have been a solid anti-Greninja card, but would likely have lacked utility outside of that specific matchup. We have seen the coin flip based energy removal effects in Pocket with cards such as Guzzlord EX and consistent removal in Beedrill EX, yet neither have truly broken out as massively competitive, and likely Vaporeon wouldn't have either. The last card to take a look at from Majestic Dawn is Suwama Chiaki's Omanyte. Following the design philosophy in the EX era, Omanyte now evolves specifically from the Helix Fossil, rather than the mysterious fossil released in the early sets of the Pokémon TCG. As such, each of these fossils have unique effects, and Helix Fossil and Dome Fossil both have amazing effects to balance out the drawbacks of them being trainer cards. When you place a water energy on the Helix Fossil, you can instantly evolve into any Omanyte, which gets the Stage 1 Pokemon on the field immediately. Omanyte itself is interesting as you can recur a Helix Fossil, Dome Fossil, or Old Amber from your discard pile onto your bench. It also has an attack for 2 energy that deals 20 damage to the active and 10 to the bench. While this isn't groundbreaking, it sets the tone for Omastar, its evolution, and likely you won't be using this attack anyway. Instead, you will likely evolve into Omastar and use its Pokepower of Primal Swirl to devolve all of your opponent's benched Pokemon. Now the problem here is that you just put all those cards back into your opponent's hand, which is only good if there are enough damage counters on the bench Pokemon to KO them, or it otherwise shuts off abilities that were interfering with your turn, since when it's your opponent's turn, they can just evolve everything again. Overall, this line was just incredibly niche, and it's no surprise that it saw no play in its debut. This lack of play continued in Genetic Apex, with the Omanyte line suffering from the lack of searchability for the Helix Fossil card. In addition, Omanyte's stat line of 90 HP and 1 attack for 1 energy dealing 40 damage wasn't anything groundbreaking when, in the same amount of turns, it could be KO'd by Starmie EX in 1 hit, assuming first energy advantage. Omastar was also similarly unimpressive, boasting only 140 HP for Stage 2 and a weak 70 damage attack for 3 energy. This attack did have the interesting effect of locking your opponent from attacking, but at the time it would never get this far due to the meta being what it was, and nowadays there's just so much flexibility around switching in and out, considering cards such as Celesteela and Solgaleo, that it is functionally useless. However, it may have seen more play had the Helix Fossil retained its instant evolution ability, giving you a relatively bulky Stage 1 on your first turn. While it likely would have not made this Pokemon meta relevant, it at least would give some utility to offset the inherent downside of running fossils. The last set we will be looking at today is the 6th main expansion from the 4th generation. Released on August 20th, 2008, Legends Awaken contained 146 cards with 7 new Pokemon Level X. Specifically, one of the most powerful Pokemon in this format, Mewtwo Level X, was released here. In Pocket, 2 Pokemon have so far been carried over. The first of these 2 is Misdreavus. Illustrated by Sumiyoshi Kizuki, Misdreavus was actually the end of its line in the set, even though in the 4th generation it received an evolution in Mismagius. Later, Mismagius from Stormfront would be the ideal card to counter the extremely powerful Mewtwo Level X. Anyway, Misdreavus had 2 attacks, but you'd usually only use it for its first one, which required no energy and meant Misdreavus could be slotted into any color deck. Show Off allowed you to search any basic energy card at no cost, meaning it was a great consistency piece and opener in multicolored decks, so you can grab exactly the energy you needed. However, at that time, there really wasn't a deck that could make great use of this ability. so it saw no play when it was released. This functionally was the same result in Spacetime Smackdown. Misdreavus had the standard 60 HP, 1 attack for 20 damage template. However, it did get an EX evolution. When we looked at the EX Pokemon at the time of release in Spacetime Smackdown, Misdreavus was rated as the worst card, and we're only able to find one deck list that ran it. So far, this has remained the same. This Misdreavus was also immediately outclassed by a promo version that guaranteed confusion on your opponent, providing a little bit more utility. It still wasn't good, but at least was better. Needless to say, these cards were not good and avoided by pretty much everyone. However, if Misdreavus was 1-to-1 carried over, and it attached an energy of your choice to any Pokemon for its attack, I think it would have been the card to make Dragon-type decks work. The biggest drawback of the Dragon-type in Pocket is the requirement for 2 different types of energy to make their attacks work. If Misdreavus could pick from the 2 that these decks typically run, the type could become meta-relevant overnight. The next card from Legends Awaken, and the last card to discuss in today's video, is Skitty by Sumiyoshi Kizuki. In its debut, Skitty is nothing special with 2 attacks for 1 energy each, Growl that reduces damage by 20, and Scratch that deals 10. However, this is a common template for Skitty in the TCG, as it usually has very low cost attacks, and then its evolution Delcatty usually has some kind of energy related attack, such as what we have seen in the past during the 3rd generation. We do still see that here with Energy Assist dealing 30 and allowing you to attach an energy from the discard pile to one of your benched Pokemon. It also has the Attracting Body Pokebody that, on a coin flip, confuses the opponent's Pokemon when Delcatty is knocked out. Overall, this version of the Delcatty line is probably one of the weakest ones printed in the TCG, which means that it is no surprise that it saw no play in Legends Awaken. In Pocket, a lot of this templating has carried over. Skitty is pretty standard 60 HP, 20 damage for 1 energy attacker. However, Delcatty is almost the same as it was in Legends Awaken, just without the kind of useless Pokebody. For 1 energy, you deal 30 damage and attach a colorless energy to any bench Pokemon. This did see some play in Promo Rayquaza EX decks as an energy accelerant alongside Manaphy, and allowed those decks to do something to the Pom-Pom or Ikorio. However, being a tech card and a niche deck doesn't make this card particularly viable. Though it is really neat that some Pokemon have a general identity, and this is carried over even across formats and game design. And that's all we have for today. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this and want to see more. Overall, my impressions from looking at these cards is that if the originals were 1-to-1 translated over, we wouldn't see any of them be meta-defining. But it would have breathed a lot of life into the game, especially early on. It is also interesting to see the cards like Skitty, which maintain their design philosophy from the physical TCG to a digital service such as Pocket.